It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, the end of 42 years of hard work. My colleagues had decorated the hall with ribbons and flowers. There was laughter, applause, and cake. My son and his wife stood in the front row, smiling. Or so I thought. Then she turned toward me, her voice cutting through the noise like glass. "You're a pathetic old woman living off my husband now." The laughter stopped, except for my son's small, cruel chuckle. I didn't speak. I just smiled. If you're watching this, please like and subscribe, because that smile changed everything. The sound of her voice still echoes in my mind like a cold draft through an empty room. It wasn't the words alone that stung. It was the timing. My retirement party was meant to be a celebration, not a stage for humiliation. The hall was full of faces I had worked with for decades. Friends, juniors, people who had seen me through exhaustion, triumph, and endless late nights. The room that had once respected me now turned silent, holding its breath. I had spent years in that office, guiding others with patience, always keeping my head high even when life bent me low. Yet, in one single sentence, my daughter-in-law managed to undo every ounce of dignity I had built in their eyes. "You're a pathetic old woman living off my husband now." The words slipped from her lips so easily, coated in sugar, sharp with venom, and my son, my only child, laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, not loud or mocking. It was worse. It was the laugh of someone too weak to defend what was right. My hands trembled slightly as I held the knife to cut the cake. The clapping that followed felt forced, hollow, like a room full of people pretending they hadn't just witnessed something ugly. I smiled anyway. Years of endurance had taught me how to smile through storms, but inside, my heart cracked quietly, like old porcelain. I glanced around, colleagues exchanging awkward glances, eyes darting to the floor, unsure whether to comfort me or carry on pretending. No one dared to speak. I had worked 42 years in that building. I had been the first to arrive and the last to leave most days. I'd trained employees who were now department heads, written policies still used long after I retired, and mentored countless young women who called me their second mother. Yet here I stood, the woman of the hour, reduced to a punchline by the one person I had once welcomed into my family with open arms. My son kept sipping his drink, pretending not to notice the looks of disapproval around him. I studied his face, the same face I had kissed goodnight through fevers, the same eyes that once looked at me with affection. Now they looked away in shame or perhaps indifference. I didn't know which hurt more. Maybe both. The event continued as if nothing had happened. Someone gave a speech. Someone else cracked a joke to change the air. But the moment had already marked me. It was as if the lights had dimmed slightly, the room colder now, even under the glare of chandeliers. I stood there, smiling, cutting the cake, thanking people for coming, even as my chest ached with betrayal. Every word of gratitude tasted like ash. When it ended, people came to shake my hand, out of habit, not warmth. Some muttered things like, "Ignore it," or "She didn't mean it." But words like those don't slip by accident. They come from rot, quiet, hidden, spreading for years before they finally show. I had felt that rot for a long time in their behavior. Little things. The way she rolled her eyes when I offered help. The way he defended her when she mocked me. The way I began shrinking in my own home without realizing. Tonight wasn't new. It was just the first time they'd done it in public. After everyone left, I stayed behind to help the cleaners. Out of habit again. The hall looked empty now, chairs stacked, crumbs scattered. The place smelled of flowers, frosting, and humiliation. I sat for a moment, staring at the stage where she had stood so confidently, insulting me in front of the people who once respected me most. That stage felt like a battlefield I hadn't agreed to fight on. But while sitting there, something inside me shifted. It wasn't rage. It wasn't sadness. It was clarity. For years, I had been giving pieces of myself, my money, my home, my time, to people who measured my worth in what I could offer them. That night, I realized they could only take from me what I allowed. And I was done allowing. When I walked out of that building for the last time, the cold air hit my face, and I took the deepest breath of my life. My career had ended, yes, but something far more powerful had just begun. They thought I'd shrink after her insult, but I straightened my back instead. Because I finally understood. Being called pathetic by the ungrateful doesn't make you small. It means you're standing next to people too small to see your worth. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't plan revenge. I planned respect. Mine. Before that night, before the insult that echoed through my retirement hall, my life was defined by routine, sacrifice, and silent endurance. I had worked 42 years in the same office, starting as a clerk barely out of school, wearing the same 2 pairs of shoes until the soles wore thin, climbing slowly through persistence, not privilege. Every promotion came with a little more pay and a little less energy. But I never stopped showing up. I was never the smartest in the room, but I was always the most reliable. When I became a mother, my world shrank, not out of loss, but out of devotion. My husband had passed when my son was barely 3 years old. There were no grandparents to lean on, no siblings nearby. It was just me and that small boy, the sound of his laughter in the evenings, and the clock ticking in the kitchen while I packed his lunches and ironed his school shirts for the next day. I sewed his first blazer by hand, staying up till midnight with an old machine that often jammed, but I refused to send him to school without a proper uniform. Money was always short. I remember standing at grocery counters counting coins, pretending to have forgotten something so I could quietly put 1 or 2 items back. But my son never knew that. He always had enough. A warm meal, new books, and the comfort of knowing his mother would fix everything, no matter how tired she was. When he grew older, he wanted to study in a different city. I sold my wedding jewelry to pay for his first semester. I told everyone it was my choice, that gold meant nothing to me. The truth was, it broke my heart. But his future mattered more than any memory I could wear. When he graduated, I cried in the back of the auditorium, too proud to wipe my tears. I watched him stand there in his gown, receiving the certificate I had worked half my life to make possible. People congratulated me, saying, "You must be so proud." I was. I thought that day would be the foundation of a bond no one could break. But sometimes, love makes you blind to small cracks until the entire structure collapses. When he got married, I welcomed his wife as my own. I cooked her favorite meals, made space for her ideas, and even redecorated the house so she'd feel like it was hers. I didn't want to be the kind of mother-in-law people whisper about, controlling or bitter. I wanted to give them a home full of peace. I gave them half of my savings to buy their first apartment. They said they'd pay me back, but I never asked for a cent. A mother doesn't lend. She gives. But over the years, I started noticing changes. Small ones at first. My calls went unanswered. My invitations to dinner were met with excuses. When they visited, they spent more time on their phones than talking. The warmth that once filled the room was replaced by polite distance. I told myself it was just modern life. People get busy. Families change. I tried to understand, even when understanding hurt. Every month I'd send them small gifts, groceries or sometimes money, saying it was for emergencies. My colleagues teased me, saying I was spoiling them. I just smiled and said, "They're my children." I truly believed love returned when given enough times. But I learned later, love without respect is like pouring water into a cracked pot. No matter how much you give, it never fills. When my retirement party was planned, I was excited. I thought it would be a day to celebrate not just my work, but my journey. A journey of building everything from nothing. I even invited my son and his wife with genuine pride, thinking they'd stand by me, proud of the woman who raised him through storms. Instead, I stood there, in the same hall that had witnessed my decades of devotion, and watched the people I'd loved most dismantle my dignity in seconds. All the sleepless nights, the skipped meals, the sacrifices, they flashed before my eyes that night. Every ounce of love I'd poured into my son came rushing back, not as warmth, but as pain. Yet I didn't cry. Because deep down, even in that moment, I knew something they didn't. They thought I was powerless, a worn-out old woman whose worth had expired. But they didn't know that every document, every signature, every account I had ever built still carried my name. That was the night I realized that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stays quiet for decades, waiting for the right insult to wake it up. That night at my retirement party, her words didn't wound me as much as his silence did. Silence, when it comes from someone you love, feels like abandonment disguised as peace. As my daughter-in-law's laughter faded into the murmurs of the crowd, I waited, even if for a second, for my son to speak. I wanted him to say something, anything, that could soften the sting, something that could tell me I hadn't raised a stranger. But he didn't. He simply lifted his glass, pretending to sip his drink, eyes darting between his wife and the crowd. His face carried a look I couldn't read, embarrassment, hesitation, or maybe guilt. Whatever it wasn't courage. I had seen him speak up for friends, defend colleagues, argue with bosses. But for his mother, there was nothing. Just silence. A silence so thick it filled the room louder than the insult itself. My colleagues looked at me, unsure whether to intervene or act as if nothing had happened. I caught glimpses of pity on their faces, the kind people wear when they witness something uncomfortable but can't fix it. The same people who once admired my strength now watched me crumble behind a forced smile. I wanted to tell them I was fine, that it didn't hurt, but my throat refused to open. The laughter from across the hall continued faintly, like background noise to my humiliation. My son had always been my pride, my reason for surviving when everything else had fallen apart. I remembered when he was younger, running to me after school with scraped knees, whispering, "Don't worry, Mom, I'm brave." Where had that bravery gone? Somewhere between the responsibilities of adulthood and the poison of influence, he had traded integrity for convenience. I had raised him to stand tall, not to blend into the crowd when wrong stood before him. The more I looked at him that night, the more I realized how far we had drifted. The boy I raised had turned into a man who measured respect by comfort. My love had made him soft, not strong. I wanted him to defend me, not because I was weak, but because I had defended him my entire life. I had stood between him and the world when he was fragile. I had fought for him in ways he'd never even known. But when the moment came for him to stand between me and disrespect, he chose to stand behind silence. He didn't meet my eyes once during the rest of the evening. When people gathered around the cake, he whispered something to his wife and walked out early. The coldness of his departure cut deeper than her insult. I watched him go, the door swinging shut behind him, and I realized that distance isn't measured in miles. It's measured in silence. He was standing only a few steps away, but I had never felt further from him. After the party ended, I stayed behind. The cleaners began stacking chairs. The decorations started coming down, and I stood there in my neat dress, still clutching the gift box someone had given me. The hall that had once felt full of life now felt hollow. I looked at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Time moved forward, but I stayed frozen in that moment. I thought about all the years of devotion, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices that led to this very silence. It wasn't rage that filled me. It was grief. The kind of grief that doesn't make you cry, but hardens you instead. When I reached home, the house was dark. Their laughter still echoed faintly in my ears. I sat at the table, turned on the small lamp, and stared at my reflection in the window. I looked older than I had that morning, not because of years, but because of the weight of realization. That motherhood doesn't end when your child grows up. It ends when he forgets what it means to protect the hand that once fed him. I didn't sleep that night. I thought about what silence meant, not just his, but mine. All these years, I had let small insults pass. I had excused behavior, justified coldness, told myself that patience was love. But that night, something inside me shifted. Silence was no longer peace, it was permission, and I would never give that permission again. When the sun rose the next morning, I made my tea and sat by the window. The world outside looked the same, but I wasn't. Something inside me had closed. The chapter of waiting to be respected. My son had chosen silence in that hall, but soon he would learn that silence could be powerful, not the kind that hides, but the kind that prepares. When I got home that night, the house greeted me with silence. Not the peaceful kind that comes with rest, but the kind that presses on your chest like a weight. The kind that hums with questions you can't answer. I slipped off my shoes, placed my purse on the table, and sat in the same chair where I had once waited for my son to return from school. The clock on the wall ticked softly, the only sound in a house that no longer felt like mine. The humiliation from the party still lingered, like smoke that refused to leave after a fire. Every laugh, every stare, every second of that moment played again in my mind. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that words were just words. But it did matter. Not because of the insult. I'd lived long enough to hear worse from the world. It mattered because of who said it and who stayed silent. When betrayal comes from the people you raised, it doesn't cut the skin, it cuts the soul. I went to my bedroom and pulled out an old photo album from the drawer. The pages had curled slightly at the edges, and some photos had begun to fade. There he was, my son as a child, missing a tooth, smiling in front of a Christmas tree. There he was again, standing proudly in his graduation robe, his arm around me. There we were, laughing in our first home, where every crack in the wall carried a story of survival. I ran my fingers over the photographs, tracing his face like I was trying to remember who he used to be. The more I turned the pages, the more I realized how much of myself I had given to build his world. Every dream he achieved had my sacrifices buried beneath it, uncredited, unspoken, unpaid. I wasn't angry at him that night. I was angry at myself for allowing this version of him to exist. I had mistaken endless forgiveness for love. I had confused silence with peace. I had allowed myself to become small so that he could stand tall. I didn't cry. Not once. My eyes stung, yes, but the tears refused to fall. Maybe I was too tired, or maybe some part of me had finally run out of softness. Instead, I sat there until dawn, watching the shadows change shape on the walls. Every hour felt like a reminder that I had spent a lifetime giving without asking for anything in return, and this was my reward. When the morning light crept through the curtains, I stood up and made tea. The bitterness of the first sip grounded me. It reminded me that even after the harshest insult, life goes on, but not in the same way. Something inside me had shifted, quietly, permanently. I didn't plan revenge. I planned distance. I knew that confronting them in anger would only make me look small in their eyes, the same eyes that already saw me as old and weak. So, I decided to do what strong people do when they are underestimated. I stayed silent, but I started planning. I wouldn't let them see my pain. Pain, when shown to cruel people, becomes their satisfaction. So I hid it behind the calmness of routine. I cleaned the kitchen, watered the plants, folded the same old tablecloth, and made breakfast for one. That day, I also realized something powerful. Respect is not taken from you in one moment. It's slowly chipped away each time you let someone treat you like less. I had let too many small things slide, believing they were harmless. But small wounds bleed too, just slower. That night at the party was not the first insult. It was simply the first one spoken loud enough for the world to hear. In the evening, I looked out the window and saw the streetlights flicker on. The world carried on as if nothing had happened, but I had already changed. I sat at the dining table, the one I had bought with my first bonus, and wrote a single line in my notebook. When respect leaves the room, leave with it. I didn't know yet what I would do, but I knew I would do something. That night, I went to bed without checking my phone, without waiting for an apology that would never come. I stared at the ceiling and let the stillness wrap around me like armor. For the first time in years, I wasn't scared of being alone, because now I understood something deeper than pain. Solitude, when earned by dignity, is not loneliness. It's liberation. The next morning came softly, the sunlight spilling across the curtains as if the world itself had forgiven the night before. But I hadn't. I moved slowly, my body stiff from sleeplessness, my mind sharper than it had been in years. Pain has a way of clearing the fog, of reminding you what truly matters. I sat at my small dining table with a pen and notepad, the same place where I'd once written grocery lists and holiday plans. But that morning, I began a different kind of list, one that would change the meaning of everything I'd built. First, I wrote down every asset, every document, every shared account. The small savings from my pension, the joint ownership on the house, the investments I had helped him start, all neatly listed, one beneath another. My hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from realization. For years, I had told myself I was secure because my son would take care of me. But now I saw the truth. My security was never meant to depend on anyone's kindness. It had always lived in these papers, in my own name, quietly waiting for me to remember my strength. I opened the drawer under the cabinet and pulled out the brown folder that hadn't seen daylight in years. It still smelled faintly of ink and dust. Inside were the savings certificates I'd kept since my husband passed, the original deed to this house, and the pension letters with my name printed bold across the top. Each paper carried the story of a lifetime, not of wealth, but of willpower. Every signature was a reminder that I hadn't just survived the years. I had built them. For hours I read through every document, every line of fine print. My lawyer had once told me, "Power isn't loud, it's quiet, printed, and legally binding." That line returned to me like a whisper from the past. I realized that the woman they mocked as pathetic still held quiet control over their comfort. The roof they slept under, the car they drove, the future they bragged about. All of it had roots that began with me. They had forgotten that, but the law had not. I decided then that my response would not come through shouting or shame. I wouldn't match their noise. I would answer with silence dressed in authority. I would show them what true control looks like. Calm, deliberate, written in black and white. By noon, I called my lawyer's office. My voice was steady, polite, professional. When his assistant answered, I said only that I needed to make changes to my documents. No urgency, no emotion. The appointment was set for the next day. I hung up and placed the receiver back gently. For the first time since the party, my breathing felt even. That afternoon, I cleaned the house with purpose. Dusting shelves, folding curtains, organizing drawers. Every movement steadied me. It wasn't about tidying, it was about reclaiming space. Each stroke of the cloth was a small declaration. This home belongs to me. The insult from the party no longer echoed in my head. It had turned into quiet determination, the kind that doesn't fade overnight. When evening came, I brewed tea and sat by the window again. The city lights blinked in the distance, small but unyielding, much like me. I took out my notepad once more and wrote one sentence beneath my list. They taught me shame. I will teach them consequence. Then I underlined it twice. The next morning, I dressed neatly. Gray coat, polished shoes, the same pearl earrings my husband had given me years ago. I walked into the lawyer's office not as a grieving mother or an insulted retiree, but as a woman of standing, reclaiming her place in her own story. The lawyer greeted me kindly, surprised perhaps by the firmness in my voice. I explained the changes. I wanted my will revised, my property restructured, and my son's joint claim dissolved. Every word I spoke was measured, precise. There was no anger left, only clarity. When I signed the papers, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. True peace doesn't come from revenge. It comes from restoring balance. It comes from knowing that no matter how much disrespect others throw your way, you can still stand tall, unshaken, and act with reason. I walked out of that office into the cool air, the sun warming my face. I didn't feel old anymore. I didn't feel pathetic. I felt powerful in the quietest way a person can, through choice. My story wasn't ending with their laughter, it was just beginning with my signature. The morning after my meeting with the lawyer felt different. The air seemed clearer, my mind sharper. I had made my choice. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. I wasn't going to let anger guide me. I was going to let clarity do the work. So I picked up the phone, dialed a familiar number, and took the next quiet step that would close the chapter my son and his wife had opened with cruelty. When the lawyer answered, his tone carried a hint of curiosity. He had seen countless families torn apart by greed, pride, or misunderstanding. But something in my voice told him this was not about revenge. It was about dignity. I spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. I confirmed the changes we discussed. my revised will, my withdrawal of joint ownership, and the allocation of funds to a women's shelter. Then I asked for something final, a formal notice to be mailed to my son and daughter-in-law, informing them of the legal adjustments. No explanations, no accusations. Just facts. When I hung up, there was no tremor in my hands. For years, I had associated power with noise, with shouting, arguing, proving myself. But now I realized true power doesn't shout. It whispers through action. I brewed myself a cup of tea, watched the steam rise, and felt the faintest smile form. The insult from that retirement party had started as a wound, but now it was a window. One that showed me exactly who I was dealing with and what I was capable of. That same afternoon, I gathered the remaining paperwork, property titles, investment bonds, and insurance files, and arranged them neatly into envelopes. Everything had a place, and every paper had a story. As I looked through them, I remembered the decades of labor that made each page possible. I remembered the early mornings catching buses in the rain, the long nights spent balancing ledgers under dim light, the endless effort to make sure my son never felt the hunger or fear that I once did. Every sacrifice, every choice had led to a life of security for him, and now I was taking back the part of that life that still belonged to me. By evening, my lawyer had sent confirmation that the letters were on their way. The sound of that small notification, the click of a sent email, echoed louder than any confrontation could have. I didn't need to raise my voice at my son. The law would speak for me in the most professional, undeniable tone possible. The next morning, I received a call from the women's shelter. They had received the initial paperwork about the donation and wanted to thank me personally. The woman on the line spoke gently, her voice soft with surprise and gratitude. She said the funds would help them house and support women escaping situations of neglect and emotional abuse. I closed my eyes as she spoke. I didn't tell her that I knew exactly how that kind of silence feels, the kind that eats away at your worth. I simply thanked her and said, "Use it well." As the days passed, I found peace in my routine again. I started taking small walks, reading books I hadn't touched in years, and cooking for myself without rushing. Each ordinary act felt extraordinary now because it was mine. Unobserved, undemanded, unjudged. The insult that once felt like a chain had turned into a key. A week later, the phone rang again. I didn't need to check the caller ID. I knew it was him. The silence on the line before he spoke was thick, hesitant. He must have received the notice by then, the official stamped reminder that the woman they mocked still held ownership and authority. His voice trembled as he said, "Mom, can we talk?" I took a slow breath, set down my teacup, and replied evenly, "Of course." Nothing more. No anger, no relief, just composure. I wanted him to feel the weight of his own choices, not through my shouting, but through my calm. When he and his wife arrived later that evening, their confidence had melted into unease. They expected tears or a confrontation. Instead, they found quiet dignity. I listened as they stumbled through explanations, jokes gone too far, stress, misunderstanding. Words people use when they're desperate to undo what they can no longer hide from. I didn't interrupt. I let them talk until the noise ran out. Then, when the silence settled again, I said only, "The papers have already spoken." That was all. I didn't need to justify, threaten, or gloat. My decision was already printed, signed, and sealed, immutable. As they sat there, shifting in discomfort, I poured tea for all of us, steady hands serving unsteady hearts. When they left, I closed the door softly behind them. The sound of that latch clicking felt like closure. Not a punishment, but a boundary finally restored. I walked to my desk, placed my pen beside the folder, and whispered to myself, "Control is quiet." That night, I slept without dreams, without regret. My son might never understand what I had truly taught him, but I did. And that was enough. The days that followed were eerily quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that hums before a storm. I went about my mornings as usual: tea at dawn, newspaper folded neatly, a walk to the corner shop. Life continued, steady and small. But underneath that rhythm, I knew ripples were forming elsewhere. Somewhere in a large modern home with glass windows and laughter that used to be familiar, two people were beginning to understand what they had done. By the third morning, my phone began to buzz. Messages from my son, long paragraphs of confusion and disbelief. "Mom, what's happening? Why are the accounts restricted? Did something go wrong with the house title?" I didn't reply. I had said everything through my signature. The lawyer had processed all changes, and formal notices had reached their bank and estate accounts. My removal of his name from the joint assets wasn't vindictive. It was procedural. It was clean, legal, and final. I imagined their breakfast table that morning. Silence where comfort used to be. His wife scrolling her phone, eyes wide. My son rubbing his temples, realizing too late that a mother's power doesn't vanish just because her hair turns gray. That was the beginning of their panic. But I didn't take pleasure in it. I only felt relief. Relief that, for once, my value wasn't tied to how softly I spoke or how kindly I smiled. It was tied to ink, documentation, and justice. Around noon, I received a call from the bank manager, a polite man who had helped me handle my pension years ago. He confirmed everything had gone through smoothly. The transfer of property, the new ownership records, the donation documents, all properly filed. He congratulated me, perhaps unaware of the story behind it. "You've handled this wisely," he said. I thanked him, and when I hung up, I realized something profound. Dignity is a kind of wealth, too, and it doesn't depreciate with age. 2 days later there was a knock at my door. Not gentle, not polite, urgent. I knew who it was before I opened it. My son stood there, his face pale, his wife hovering behind him, eyes red but proud. They didn't come out of love. They came out of shock. I could see it in the stiffness of their posture, in the tremor of his hands clutching a letter, the official notice. He started speaking before I could even invite them in. His words tumbled over each other, excuses, confusion, attempts at justification. "We didn't mean what we said. You misunderstood. It was just a joke." I let him talk until he had nothing left but silence. Then I stepped aside and gestured toward the sitting room. He entered hesitantly, as though the air itself might accuse him. The room hadn't changed, but something else had. The balance of power. For years, I had stood small in that room, letting their opinions carry weight. Now, the silence belonged to me. He placed the letter on the table, the same table where I had celebrated birthdays, written homework with him, and later sat alone after his visits stopped. I looked at the paper calmly. The stamp of my lawyer sat crisp in blue ink at the bottom. The document wasn't just legal proof, it was emotional proof, tangible evidence that I was not powerless. His wife tried to speak next. Her tone had changed. No arrogance, no mockery, only unease. She apologized clumsily, her voice soft. She said she never meant to offend me, that it had been a misunderstanding at the party. But apologies made after consequences aren't confessions. They're reactions. I nodded politely and poured tea into 3 cups. My movements were slow, deliberate. I wanted them to feel the weight of calmness, because calm from a wounded person is heavier than anger. We drank in silence. The clock ticked. Outside, the world carried on, children playing, cars passing, while inside, everything they took for granted was being redefined. I finally broke the quiet with one line. The documents have already spoken. I didn't need to say more. The meaning was clear. I hadn't taken revenge. I had simply equalized the imbalance they created. They left not long after, quiet and thoughtful. My son didn't meet my eyes as he walked out. His wife murmured something under her breath. Maybe guilt, maybe pride. It didn't matter. The door closed gently behind them. That night I slept deeply. For years my mind had been restless, replaying arguments, wishing for understanding. But that evening, for the first time, I felt light. I didn't hate them. I just didn't carry them anymore. I had returned to myself, the woman who had built a life from nothing, raised a family from scraps, and rebuilt peace from ashes. Justice doesn't always need to roar. Sometimes it just needs to be delivered by mail, signed in black ink, and sealed with silence. 3 days passed before the silence finally settled the way it was meant to. Not the silence of fear or loss, but the stillness of understanding. The house seemed softer in those days. The ticking clock no longer sounded like loneliness. It sounded like peace. The insult, the laughter, the humiliation at that retirement party, all of it had faded into the distance like echoes swallowed by time. What remained was something sharper, clearer, the power of stillness. On the 4th morning, I woke up early and brewed coffee. The sky was pale gray, and the air carried a faint chill. I sat by the window where I used to wait for phone calls that never came, and I realized I no longer cared if they did. For years, I had mistaken noise for connection. Loud dinners, busy weekends, shallow laughter that felt like love. But love, I finally learned, doesn't need volume. It needs presence. And presence can't coexist with pride. The phone vibrated once more on the table. Another message from my son. Short this time. We didn't mean to hurt you. I looked at the screen, read it twice, and then simply placed the phone face down. Forgiveness doesn't always need to be spoken. Sometimes it lives in the decision to move forward without reopening the wound. I had forgiven him already, but forgiveness doesn't mean return. Later that day, I took a slow walk around the garden. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and morning dew. I trimmed the small rose bush near the gate, the one that had grown wild these past months. My hands worked with a kind of rhythm that calmed my thoughts. I had spent decades building life for others, always nurturing, always giving, always waiting for appreciation that never came. Now, every snip of the pruning shears felt like reclaiming a part of myself. I didn't need applause. I only needed peace. When I returned inside, I found the brown envelope sitting where I had left it, the one with the updated document sealed inside. I opened it one last time, not out of uncertainty, but out of satisfaction. The fresh ink glistened slightly under the light. My lawyer's signature sat neatly beside mine, the lines crisp and confident. There it was. Proof of a woman who refused to be erased. I smiled faintly, closed the folder, and placed it back into the drawer. That evening, there was another knock at the door, softer this time. When I opened it, My son stood there again. But this time, he looked smaller, quieter. The arrogance that had once clung to him was gone. He didn't come with explanations or excuses. He came with a kind of wordless apology that eyes can make when mouths can't. I didn't speak. I simply stepped aside and let him in. He sat at the table, the same table where his wife had once called me pathetic. His hands fidgeted. His eyes darted to the papers on the shelf, perhaps realizing that this house, this home, this sanctuary, now belonged entirely to me. Not just legally, but spiritually. I poured him tea. The silence between us was heavy, but not hostile. It was a silence that had purpose, the kind that teaches. Finally, he spoke. I didn't know how much you'd done for me. His voice cracked slightly. I looked at him, this grown man who had once been a boy clutching my hand to cross the street. And I said nothing. He didn't need words from me. He needed to sit in that silence and understand what it meant to lose the right to a mother's unconditional forgiveness. We sat there for a long time. No anger, no raised tones. Just understanding filling the space where pride once lived. When he finished his tea, he stood up slowly. Thank you for still opening the door, he said before leaving. I watched him walk down the path, his shoulders hunched, his pace unsteady. I didn't cry, not because I was cold, but because I had already shed the last of my tears long ago. After he left, I sat at the same table, the quiet pressing around me like a blanket. The room no longer felt empty. It felt complete. Sometimes silence isn't absence. It's arrival. The arrival of strength, of balance, of peace, earned through patience. The woman they called pathetic had rewritten her own ending without raising her voice. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the room. The walls I painted myself, the books I'd collected, the framed photos of years gone by. Everything was still here, but I was not the same. I was freer. The silence they once gave me, cruel, dismissive, sharp, now belonged to me. And in my hands, silence was no longer punishment. It was power. The days that followed unfolded like pages of a new book. Calm, deliberate, free of noise. The house, once heavy with echoes of arguments and unspoken resentment, began to breathe again. Mornings were slower now. I woke up without expectation, brewed my coffee, opened the curtains, and let sunlight spill across the same walls that had once witnessed humiliation. What was once a stage for pain had turned into a sanctuary of quiet victory. There's a certain peace that comes after standing up for yourself. Not the fiery, dramatic kind people imagine, but a deeper, steadier peace. It settles in your bones like warm light. I no longer replayed that night at the retirement party, nor the cruel laughter that followed. Those sounds had lost their sharpness. They were just memories now, faded, irrelevant. What mattered was that I had finally drawn a line, and for the first time in years, that line was drawn for me. I started spending my mornings outside more often. I'd sit on the porch with a notebook, writing small reflections. Not revenge, not regret, just gratitude for the quiet moments life still offered. Some afternoons I painted again. My brush trembled a little at first, but soon found its rhythm. The colors felt brighter, more alive. It was as if the same hands that had been used to serve others were finally allowed to create for themselves. One morning, a letter arrived. Not from my son or his wife, but from the women's shelter I had supported. It was handwritten, warm, and full of stories about lives being rebuilt. Women who had escaped homes that no longer felt like homes, finding courage again within walls that now carried my contribution. They called me Mrs. M, the woman who gave us hope. I smiled when I read that. I had given my son everything: a home, a future, unconditional love, and he used it to humiliate me. Yet, in helping strangers, I found something he never could give me: honor. Weeks later, I decided to take a small trip. Nothing grand, just a change of view. I booked a quiet seaside cottage through a friend's recommendation. When I arrived, the air was different there. Soft, salt-scented, almost forgiving. I walked along the shore barefoot, letting the waves wash over my feet. The ocean didn't ask for explanations. It didn't demand apologies. It simply moved. Steady, endless, sure of itself. I realized that was what I wanted to be now: constant, but free. Each evening, I sat on the porch of that cottage, watching the sunset turn the sky into gold and violet. Sometimes I thought of my son, not with bitterness, but with a quiet ache, the kind a mother never fully escapes. I wondered if he was learning, if he was becoming softer with age the way I once did. I hoped he was, but I also knew that my peace no longer depended on his lessons. I had my own. A few weeks into my stay, I received another message from him. It was shorter this time. "I hope you're doing well." No excuses, no questions, just a line of decency, small but real. I didn't reply right away. I let it sit, like a letter waiting for the right moment. That night, I finally wrote back, "I'm doing well. I hope you are too." Nothing more. Forgiveness doesn't need to be poetic. Sometimes it's just 2 sentences that end a long war. When I returned home, everything looked the same, but felt new. The air inside the house was lighter, the rooms brighter. I replaced the framed photo from my retirement party, the one where I stood smiling beside those who had hurt me, with a painting I finished at the cottage. A calm ocean under a golden sky. I hung it where I could see it every morning. It reminded me that even storms end eventually. Now, when neighbors visit, they say I look younger, more alive. Maybe peace has that effect. It clears the face the way rain clears dust from windows. I spend my days quietly, living not for validation, but for serenity. And sometimes, when the wind moves through the open window and the house creaks softly, it almost feels like it's breathing along with me. Finally, without tension. The insult that once made the room fall silent had taught me something profound. Silence can either be your prison or your power. The choice is yours. I chose power, not over others, but over my own pain. I no longer measure my worth by how much I'm needed, loved, or remembered. I measure it by how peacefully I can live with myself. And in that peace, I found the one thing my son and his wife will spend their lives searching for: freedom that comes not from control, but from letting go. Even now, as I sit in this quiet house, the evening light stretching across the floorboards, I can still remember the moment everything shifted, the exact second I stopped living for their approval and started living for my own peace. People think strength always looks loud, fiery, or defiant. But sometimes, strength looks like a calm old woman sitting by a window, sipping tea, smiling softly because she knows she didn't let cruelty change her heart. For a long time, I thought my story had ended the day my son laughed at that cruel joke. I thought dignity was something you either kept or lost forever. But life has a strange way of reminding you that it's never too late to stand up, even if you stand up alone. The humiliation they gave me was public. The redemption I chose was private. And that's the kind of victory that stays, the quiet kind. I've learned that power doesn't always come from having the last word. It comes from knowing you don't need to speak at all. When they called me pathetic, I didn't fight back. I didn't shout. I didn't throw back an insult. I went home, pulled out my documents, and used the same silence they gave me to rebuild my strength. In this world, people mistake softness for weakness. But they forget that softness is what endures when everything hard eventually breaks. Every day now begins the same way. I wake up, open the window, and let in the wind. I breathe deeply, not because I'm proud of what I did, but because I can finally breathe without permission. I don't wait for calls or visits. I don't check messages hoping for apologies. I've realized something that took me 70 years to learn. Not every story ends with reconciliation. Some just end with freedom, and that's enough. Sometimes neighbors ask me if I regret cutting ties, if I ever wish things were different. I always smile and tell them this. I didn't cut ties. I untangled myself. I freed myself from the knots of guilt, obligation, and fear that mothers are taught to carry. I'll always love my son. But love doesn't mean surrender. It means hoping he learns, just as I did, that respect can't be borrowed. It must be earned every single day. I keep that signed paper in a small drawer beside my bed, not as revenge, but as remembrance. It reminds me of the day I stopped begging for value and started proving it to myself. The woman they once dismissed as fragile now owns her own peace. Because peace, unlike money or status, can't be taken away. It has to be built from the inside. Sometimes, when I walk through town, I see young mothers holding their children, tired, patient, full of hope. I want to tell them, be kind, but never invisible. Give, but never disappear. Love, but never forget yourself. Because one day, those same children may grow taller, louder, prouder, and they'll test the limits of your heart. You must remember where those limits are. If you're watching this, maybe you've been disrespected too. Maybe someone you raised forgot your worth. Maybe they've spoken to you like you don't matter anymore. Let me tell you, you still do. You matter in ways they can't measure, because you've built things they now stand on. You've carried them through storms they don't even remember. You don't need their approval to prove that. You already proved it by surviving. Don't let pain turn you cruel. Don't let betrayal make you bitter. Let it make you wiser, calmer, stronger. Sometimes you don't need to burn bridges. You just need to stop crossing them. Let those who wronged you stand on the other side, watching as you walk away without anger, without regret. That's when they realize who truly had the power all along. My son once laughed at me in front of a room full of people. But that laughter died in silence the day I reminded him who built the home, who paid the bills, who stood through decades of sacrifice. I didn't remind him with anger. I reminded him with action. And now I live quietly. Not rich, not famous, but free. So if your own child, your spouse, or anyone you once loved ever makes you feel small, don't rush to prove them wrong. Sit still, gather your strength. Let the silence work for you. Then move with grace, not rage. Because the most powerful revenge isn't noise, it's dignity. Tell me, if your own child laughed while someone called you pathetic, would you cry and walk away? Or would you let silence write the final chapter just like I did?